The talk that I gave today, the presentation, was on conducting child custody evaluations in a scientific way when parental alienation and domestic violence is alleged. If there's parental alienation allegations or domestic violence allegations that are co-occurring, meaning that they're being alleged in the same case, you want to be able to ask questions, and that begins with, is this really happening? In the data gathering process, you want to develop an understanding of what's going on with this family by not only just interviewing them, but you want to make observations. And so when you do a scientifically informed custody evaluation, you're going to generate hypotheses, and then you're going to test the hypotheses to see whether they're true or false. And in the case of parental alienation, we rely on the scientific literature to understand what is parental alienation, how is it described, and how will we know it if we're observing it. The construct of parental alienation is described in a 5-factor model. The first factor involves an observation in the family unit or evidence to show that one or more of the children are resisting, refusing, or avoiding contact with a targeted parent. Then the second factor is evidence to show that there was a prior healthy, positive relationship between the targeted parent and the alienated child. And that's really one of the most important searches that you have to make as a behavioral scientist. You have to get a timeline and a historical reference to establish a baseline for the level of bonding and attachment that existed across time, from the time this child was born to the current status if they're in the middle of a divorce process. You want to get a deep understanding of how the family communicates and what their sense of attachment is. And so you have to become immersed in family drama so that you can get a real raw data input from how these folks feel. Factor 3, and that is to find out whether there's any abuse, neglect, or parental unfitness on the part of the targeted parent towards the alienated child. So you're going to have a lot of data, observational data, collateral interview data, data from the child, data from the father, data from the mother. If you establish that there's no serious flawed parenting that amounts to abuse or neglect, then you go to factor 4. And you want to establish whether or not a child has been exposed to parental alienation behaviors. And these would be behaviors that research tells us thwart a child's development. Corrupting behaviors, such as bad-mouthing, saying bad things to the child about the other parent, a parent that they love, that you've already established that they loved and had a good attachment with. And you've already established that they haven't been abusive. So now you have this big question. Is this child been exposed? Has this child been exposed to alienating behaviors? And if so, how long has it been going on? Has it been an isolated incident? And how do we describe those behaviors? And if the child has been exposed to parental alienation behaviors, the next step is, are they symptomatic? What's the level of impact that the exposure has on the child? One of the first symptoms we look for is there a lack of ambivalence in the child's perception of each one of the parents? The natural state of most children who come from non-abusive homes, they look at their parents with a normal, healthy level of ambivalence. Mommy and daddy, sometimes they're mean, sometimes they're nice. People, including mommy and daddy, are made up of good things and made up of bad things. And that's the way life is. That's a normal level of ambivalence. But in alienated children who have been exposed to alienating behaviors, they can develop a lack of ambivalence, where they start to view one parent as all bad, the other parent as all good. That indicates a developing level of psychopathology that we refer to as splitting. And it is a very serious state of where the child is actually entering into a split state where they have an unrealistic, irrational perception of a parent that they formerly loved and had a normal level of ambivalence for. So it's not based in reality. We correlate that with, in the literature, corrupting emotional abuse, or it can also be the result of successful brainwashing. So it's the end product of brainwashing a child to believe something bad about a person. If there's a developing splitting pathology or lack of ambivalence, the child will find ways to justify thinking of the previously loved parent as all bad. And that's where the denigration comes from. Because they have to convince themselves into this self-deception, this self-delusional state that this is a bad person. Then they might think bad of themselves because only bad people think bad things about good people. It's not right. So it would interfere with any kind of moral development if the child has, a second, third or fourth stage of moral development, moral reasoning. And then you want to look to see, is there some kind of overly enmeshed relationship between the alienated child and the favored parent? And that, if there is, it'll show up in the parental alienation symptoms of borrowed scenarios, reflexive support for the alienating parent, a child talking in adult language that's outside of the baseline for how they normally speak about adults, using adult language, and then the reflexive support for the alienator. When there's a conflict, they'll strongly ally with the favored parent and distance themselves from the targeted parent. That grows out of the literature that talks about loyalty conflicts. That if you have a split in a community and there's scarce resources and one side has all the food and the other side doesn't, you kind of have to not like that side in order to retain your access to food. So I think it's better to look at that way versus trying to pathologize and label a child as being sick. These are natural adaptive things that are done in a maladaptive way because they're not getting the child what the child really needs, which is a healthy relationship with both parents. That's the fifth factor in the five-factor model. The problematic relationship, parent-child relationship that's going on is between the alienating parent and the child, not between the targeted parent and the child. The targeted parent's relationship with that child would be healthy. And when allegations of domestic violence co-occur in the same case, so it's important as an evaluator to know what the literature says about domestic violence. So you have some sort of operational definition that you can explain where it falls in the spectrum of domestic violence. Two different typologies. One would be intimate partner terrorism, which has a coercive control component to it that's overarching between the two people. One partner is dominating, it's coercive control. Situational couple violence doesn't have the coercive control. It arises from family conflict theory. And that says that families will sometimes get into disagreements, arguments, and conflict, and those situations will escalate to violence. And for some families, that may be normal. Yelling, screaming, fighting, kicking, punching, pulling hair. So if you're an evaluator, you have to learn the language of the family, their rules, unwritten, unspoken, and you have to learn that in as much time as you can. So it may be a series of events that occurred and were limited in time, and then many years passed, and then it came out again. And sometimes you never really get to know whether or not it's occurring. So you have to make a statement in your report to the court. We don't know. So-and-so said that this happened, The other parent said it didn't. And sometimes you can. Sometimes there's lots of police reports. Sometimes there's CPS reports. Sometimes there's video. And it's always good to take those videos in context instead of trying to look at it, because it could have been an isolated incident and they could have started the video after something horrible happened on the part of the other parent. We always ground our findings in the scientific research. So our reports will be heavily footnoted, and it's all interwoven. And when we're testing a hypothesis and writing our reports, and if we do psychological testing, so it creates reliability. It makes us feel more comfortable in helping the court really get a sense of what's going on in the family. And it's always important to let the court know when there's false allegations. We have cases where people falsely allege parental alienation, and it's not there. And we don't find it, and we say so. And there's also false allegations of domestic violence. And that rate, the rate of false claims varies across, the 450 plus cases that I've worked on in the past 10 years. It fluctuates from year to year. Sometimes it's as high as 30%. False claims of parental alienation, false claims of domestic violence. Sometimes it's as low as 10%. And it's important to know that so that you don't develop an internal bias. Have those children have healthy, positive, and strong relationships with both parents. Even if parental alienation or domestic violence is occurring, you want to get them the help that they need and create face-saving ways for the perpetrators to bring themselves back to a healthy relationship with the family system. And that's why we usually recommend a family systems approach to treatment. And the relationships are what they're working on. And at the same time, helping the individual family members, but not siding with one family against the other.